Today we're ranking every major bazooka of World War II. From launcher a soldier had to load knowing it might cook him alive, to the one so effective both sides in Europe eventually copied it. And trust me, the weapon that gave this whole category its nickname isn't the one that comes out on top. Rank 11. Worst. Japanese Type 4 70mm anti-tank rocket launcher. Start with a number nobody expects. By the time the Type 4 reached combat, Japan had maybe a few hundred of them in the field. Not thousands, a few hundred, for an entire theater of war. That scarcity wasn't bad luck, it was the whole story. Japan started serious anti-tank rocket development years behind Germany and the US, and by 1944 the country building it didn't have the industrial slack left to make it well or make it often. The launcher itself was a crude open tube, sometimes built with wooden components to save metal, firing a 70mm rocket that Marines first ran into on Okinawa in the spring of 1945. Accuracy past close range was inconsistent enough that most confirmed uses were desperate, dug-in, last-ditch encounters rather than the mobile anti-tank role the design was supposed to fill. Here's the detail most videos skip. Post-war U.S. ordnance evaluation teams that examined captured Japanese rocket weapons noted the propellant and fusing quality varied wildly between individual units, meaning two Type 4s built in the same week could perform completely differently. That's not a design flaw you can train around. That's a weapon built by a war economy already collapsing under its own weight, handed to a soldier who had no way of knowing which version he'd been given. Rank 10. Panzerfaust 30. Klein, 30 meters. That's the entire effective range of the first mass-issued Panzerfaust. Closer than a lot of American football fields. Closer than the gap between a foxhole and the tank rolling toward it. The Panzerfaust wasn't a true bazooka in the reusable tube and rocket sense. It was a disposable, recoilless launcher. One shaped charge, one shot. Then a soldier threw away an empty tube and either found another one or ran. What it lacked in range it made up for in raw punch. The small 1943 Klein version could still punch through roughly 140 millimeters of armor at point-blank distance, which was more than enough to kill most Allied tanks of the period if a soldier could get close enough to use it, and stay alive doing it. That's the trade this weapon forced on every teenager and grandfather who ended up holding one later in the war. Get within 30 meters of an advancing tank, or don't bother pulling the trigger at all. Rank 9. PIAT, projector, infantry, anti-tank, Britain. Picture trying to arm a weapon by standing on it and hauling a 100-pound spring back with both arms, while someone is shooting at you. That's not an exaggeration of the PIAT's cocking procedure, it's roughly the procedure. Britain went a completely different mechanical route than everyone else on this list. No rocket motor, no backblast. The PIAT used a heavy internal spring and a firing pin to launch its bomb, a spigot mortar design that traded simplicity of propellant for brutal, physically demanding operation. At roughly 32 pounds, it was heavier than an American bazooka, harder to reload under pressure, and prone to jamming if that spring wasn't seated exactly right. And yet soldiers who mastered it trusted it in the one place it mattered most: close, chaotic, urban fighting. At Arnhem in September 1944, Major Robert Kame used a PIAT to help disable multiple German armored vehicles in the fighting around Oosterbeek, part of the action that later earned him the Victoria Cross. The weapon that was miserable to carry and worse to arm still put steel through tanks when the man behind it refused to miss. Rank 8. M1 Bazooka, United States, 1942. Every legend starts somewhere unglamorous, and the bazooka's origin is a little embarrassing. It's named after a musical instrument. Comedian Bob Burns built a goofy homemade horn out of pipe fittings in the 1930s and called it a bazooka. And when Army officers first saw the new tube-launched rocket weapon, the resemblance was close enough that the nickname stuck permanently over the weapon's actual designation. Developed by Colonel Leslie Skinner and Lieutenant Edward Uhl, the M1 rushed into combat for Operation Torch in North Africa in November 1942, only months after its first successful test. That speed came at a cost. The launcher fired its rocket using an electrical igniter powered by 2 wet cell batteries. And those batteries were miserable in the field. Humidity,
cold, and rough handling could all leave a gunner pulling the trigger on a dud circuit with a tank closing the distance. It worked often enough to prove the entire concept of a man-portable, rocket-propelled anti-tank weapon was viable. It just wasn't refined enough yet to be trusted every single time it mattered.
Rank 7. Panzerfaust, 60.
If the Klein version forced a soldier to get suicidally close, the Panzerfaust 60 at least gave him a little room to breathe, doubling the effective range to 60 meters, while boosting penetration to roughly 200 millimeters of armor. That upgrade mattered more than the number suggests. 60 meters isn't much in open country, but through a hedgerow, a rubble-choked street, or a Normandy farm lane, it was often the difference between firing from cover and firing from the open. By mid-1944, this was the version showing up in the hands not just of trained infantry, but of Volkssturm militia, older men and teenage boys given a few minutes of instruction and sent out to slow down Allied armor advancing into Germany itself. There's a dark irony sitting underneath this weapon's battlefield reputation. It was simple enough that almost anyone could be handed one and make it lethal on the first try, which is exactly why it kept getting issued to people who, in any earlier war, would never have been anywhere near a front line. Rank 6. M1A1 Bazooka. The fix came fast, because it had to. American engineers replaced the failure-prone wet cell batteries with a more reliable dry cell ignition system, and standardized the launcher's rocket motor into the M6A1 round, closing the single biggest gap between "this works on a test range" and "this works in a Tunisian sandstorm." By the fighting in Sicily and mainland Italy through 1943, the M1A1 had become the standard American infantry answer to enemy armor, not because it was elegant, but because it was finally consistent. A gunner who pulled the trigger now had a real reason to expect the rocket would actually leave the tube. Consistency doesn't make headlines the way a dramatic tank kill does, but ask any infantryman which they'd rather have, and consistency wins every time. Rank 5. RPZB 43. Panzerschreck. Ofenrohr. Here's a fact that surprises people who assume German engineering always started from a blank sheet. The Panzerschreck exists because German troops captured several M1 Bazookas from American forces during the fighting around Kasserine Pass in February 1943 and sent them back to Berlin to be studied. German engineers didn't just copy it, they scaled it up. The result fired an 88mm rocket compared to the American 60mm, delivering significantly more armor penetration in a package soldiers nicknamed the Ofenrohr, or stovepipe, for its blunt, unadorned tube shape. Early production versions shipped with no shield at all between the gunner's face and the rocket's backblast, which produced enough heat and smoke that crews sometimes needed protective gloves, a face covering, or a wet cloth just to fire it safely more than once without burns. It hit harder than anything the Allies were carrying at the time. It also asked its own gunner to trust that the flash off the back of the tube wouldn't be the thing that put him out of the fight. Rank 4. Panzerfaust 100. By the time the Panzerfaust reached its final major wartime version, it had become arguably the single most produced anti-tank weapon of the entire war. Millions of units rolling out of German factories through the last 12 months of fighting. The 100 designation reflected the improved range, and penetration held steady at roughly 200 millimeters, still enough to kill any Allied tank crew unlucky enough to get caught at that distance. What changed the weapon's legacy wasn't a speck on a datasheet, though. It was the sheer scale of issue. As Germany's front lines collapsed inward toward the Rhine and then Berlin in early 1945, the Panzerfaust 100 became the default weapon handed to defenders who had almost nothing else: home guard units, retreating infantry stripped of their heavier equipment, city defenders fighting from basement windows and rubble piles. It's a strange kind of success. A weapon judged purely on tank kills per unit built might rank this even higher. Judged on what it represents, a war machine feeding its last, least trained people into the fight with whatever was cheapest to mass produce, It's one of the bleaker entries on this entire list. Rank 3. M9. Bazooka. Paratroopers had a problem the infantry didn't. A full-length bazooka tube doesn't fit neatly under a parachute harness, and it definitely doesn't survive a jump strapped to the outside of a soldier's gear without getting bent or dented into uselessness. The M9 solved it with a two-piece launcher that broke down and reassembled in the field, small enough to jump with intact. American engineers used the redesign as an opportunity to fix the M1's other lingering weakness too, replacing battery-dependent ignition with a hand-cranked magneto system. Squeeze the trigger, and a mechanical generator fired the rocket directly. No battery to go dead in a foxhole overnight. It's easy to undersell a weapon whose big innovation is it comes apart for transport. But for the men who jumped into Normandy or Holland carrying one, that engineering detail was the entire difference between having a working anti-tank weapon on the ground and having two useless halves of one. Rank 2. M9A1 Bazooka. The M9A1 is the version most people picture when they hear the word bazooka from a World War II movie, and for good reason. It's the definitive, most refined American launcher of the entire war, folding in a redesigned ring sight for better accuracy at range, alongside every ignition and durability fix from earlier models. By Normandy in June 1944, and through the fighting across the Pacific Islands into 1945, this was the American infantryman's standard tool against German and Japanese armor alike. Reliable enough that gunners stopped treating a misfire as the expected outcome, and started treating it as the exception. It never matched the raw penetration of its German cousin. What it offered instead was something just as valuable in combat. A weapon a soldier could pick up, aim, and genuinely trust would do exactly what he expected it to do. Rank 1. Best. RPZB 54. Panzerschreck with shield. So, here's the twist promised at the top of this list. The weapon that gave this entire category its name, the American Bazooka, isn't the one sitting at number 1. It's the German design built by reverse engineering it. The RPZB 54 took everything the earlier shieldless Offenrohr got right and fixed the part that was hurting its own operators. A small steel splinter shield mounted just behind the rocket's exhaust, with a narrow window to aim through. That single addition meant a gunner no longer had to choose between firing the weapon and protecting his own face from the backblast. Penetration held at roughly 230 millimeters of armor, enough to threaten the frontal armor of nearly every Allied tank fielded in Europe, including the heavier late-war designs that shrugged off smaller weapons entirely. By the defense of Normandy, and again during the fighting in the Ardennes that winter, the Panzerschreck had earned a reputation Allied tank crews took seriously enough to actively route around known ambush positions rather than risk it. That's the real measure of a weapon's effectiveness. Not just what it destroyed, but what it made the other side afraid to do. It's a fitting, slightly uncomfortable way to end this list. The tube that started the whole category never stopped being useful. It just stopped being the best version of itself.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below.